Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, the European Union is considering a shift in its cohesion fund policy, potentially reallocating nearly a third of its €400 billion budget towards defense spending. This move comes amid heightened pressure for Europe to bolster its security posture and support Ukraine in response to global tensions and threats. With ongoing hearings for EU foreign security and cohesion funds commissioners, leaders are debating on how to balance economic support with defense. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these developments is Marcin Bużański, Director of the Center for Diplomacy and Negotiation at Collegium Civitas. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Very glad to be here.
So can you first help us understand what motivated EU's proposal to allow this cohesion fund to be used for defense-related investments?
Well, there are several issues at play here. For a long time, there's been an ongoing discussion on how to bolster EU's financial capacities to invest in defense. And EU cohesion funds was one of the boxes or pockets of funding that has been discussed to use for those purposes. It hasn't been originated for defense spending or spending around defense, but the circumstances certainly have been compelling to find those additional resources. There's also been a lot of talk recently about increasing EU spending, joint spending on defense through the issues of defense bonds, which had a lot of, let's say, not maybe enemies, but countries which weren't favorable to that, especially in the north, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, and Germany. And they've also pushed for a different solution to use the existing cohesion funds, shifting a little bit their allocation status to generate those funds. So this is sort of the background for why this move, let's say, has been made. A couple of things are important to note. It is not defense spending per se, meaning purchase of weapons. This is more of allocation to be aligned with the major focus of cohesion funds, mainly for leveling to reaching the same level of development of EU regions. And for that, how to connect it with defense spending, this is what the EU is doing now. So what the EU Commission is proposing to member states, saying we're not changing really how these funds work completely, we're just widening what you can use them for. What these things could be, it could be military logistics. It could be building bridges and roads to move military equipment. It could be investing in businesses, in factories of ammunitions or of weaponry, which are allocated in certain regions. So this is how these funds are created, but without doubt, it's a major move and definitely relating to a big part of the EU budget for the years 2021 to 2027.
Right. Do you think that kind of moving this cohesion fund to defense, which is perhaps not its original intended purpose, will hurt the original kind of purpose for this fund in the first place?
This has been raised. I think, well, there will be some casualties, without doubt. It's too big of an amount of money not to be. But already regions have been voicing, while concern, also understanding why this move is being made and asking that they have a seat at the decision table of how those funds are allocated, and that this can work if they're also participating in allocating those investments that would generate from those cohesion funds. So as long as this is put in place, I think that that should be fine. Even recently, the newly appointed EU Commissioner for Budget, Piotr Serafin from Poland, has underlined that this move does not mean that other areas of EU budget allocation will be hurt or forgotten, and that he will work hard to balance this out. It is also an important move in terms of the negotiation, which will start next year, for the next multi-year framework, which is the EU budget, which are starting right now, and that's going to be for the budget from 2027. I think an important thing also to underline, a very small amount of those cohesion funds have been spent up to date, about 5 to 7% of the whole pot. This is also due to COVID and the issuance of the emergency funding and the joint debt from EU to allocate to post-COVID recovery that have taken a lot of the absorption capacity for EU funds. So this is also a way to bolster the spending of the funds allocated to many countries. And here the biggest beneficiaries is Poland, Spain, Italy, for instance.
Right. So, like, if you mentioned a lot of these cohesion funds wasn't actually being utilized this time around, is there an argument to be made that perhaps there's some sort of restructuring on how these cohesion funds were allocated, or kind of how it's distributed might need a little bit of rethinking?
Certainly. I mean, you know, the EU doesn't work too fast when it comes to adapting to those changes. Cohesion funds and structural funds like that have been operating for a long time, and they've had a very important purpose, particularly for the less developed countries of the EU, and Poland here, of course, being a great example of how successfully they may work. But it is important to understand that the EU has to change how those funds will operate, because if we are looking at EU enlargement process and inviting new countries, Ukraine, Western Balkans, Moldova, this will mean that these funds, and at the same time a less amount of funds being allocated in the next budget, which is almost clear, then it means a restructuring has to happen. And reprioritization of certain areas has to happen. And while defense is such an important area right now, it's a key priority, and I think everybody in the EU agrees on that, it means that this restructuring just has to happen.
Right, like you mentioned, it is a very, very strong priority with the European Union. But do you think that relocating these funds and increasing the defense infrastructure would influence the EU relationship with NATO? Perhaps a little bit of overlapping of roles, stepping on each other's toes?
Well, these are different things. There's been a lot of discussion about the strategic autonomy of EU, or in more layman's terms, you know, creating an EU army, if you will. But this is really concepts on paper. Yes, they'll get some traction now because of the election of Donald Trump in the US, but the bottom line is that in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of the joint military defense structures, in terms of deterrence against Russia, in terms of a fighting army, there's absolutely no substitute for NATO, and will not be in many years to come. What is very important, and this has been underlined by all EU leaders right now, is to strengthen the European pillar in NATO, meaning build the capabilities. And this is where the EU funds, the EU cohesion funds can be so helpful, to help build the logistic background, to help connect the logistics systems, the supply lines, the development of defense industries among EU countries, so that they can work better within NATO. And that is very important. The other element, of course, is the increase of defense spending budgets. That is already happening across EU countries, but will need to continue. And we cannot forget about the pocket of money for Ukraine, which needs to be sustained and probably increased, considering the elections in the US. Again, you need to find funding for that. Not to mention, of course, the joint collaboration and between EU countries in training and in preparation of their forces functioning together. Interoperability, that's the term used, and NATO and the EU. But also importantly, joint intelligence sharing. There's been ideas to create a joint EU joint intelligence agency. That's been a recent report from the former Finnish president suggesting that, well received. There's a lot of push now with the new commissioner for defense. Andris Kubilius has been accepted by the EU Parliament in this role. He's going to work to make this happen in practice. So that all needs the backing of funding. And the US has said for many times, we don't want less Europe in NATO. We want more Europe in NATO. We want more investment of Euro in NATO structures. So this is important that they work closely together, but of course not. It's not something to replace NATO as a European army. That's just a concept that's not going to happen in practice.
Right. So it does seem like this redirection of cohesive fund to defense is actually quite comprehensive and very well thought out. When it comes to this current European, I'm lacking the word, actually. Yeah, the current session, there was just a little bit of expected controversy when it comes to a fragmentation of the European Parliament, which actually didn't seem to happen, except, some of the more kind of far-right isolationist pockets where whereas there were a little bit of fragmentation to be expected. How would you interpret this phenomenon?
Well, we've seen actually a pretty smooth process in terms of the hearings in the European Parliament, and we've, as mentioned before, Andreas Kubilius, the Defense Commissioner, has been approved. We've just witnessed the hearing for Kaja Kallas, which also went pretty well. She has been challenged by some of the right-wing groups at the European Parliament, particularly when it comes to her stances on Ukraine and Russia. But that's being very hawkish in this regard, as she is. But she actually delivered a well-balanced, moderately speech. She pointed out that, of course, there needs to be sustained support for Ukraine, but also that the EU wants peace, and that peace has to happen with some kind of a settlement. That's clear. So playing into Trump's talking points, but clearly underlining that this can only happen via stopping the colonial aggression that Russia is undertaking, and by arming Ukraine with enough arguments at the negotiating table through support to their efforts at the battlefield and through their defense and deterrence capabilities. And this is absolutely critical. I think there's been an agreement on that. It's only outliers that have raised this approach as an issue. She also played quite well into points about China, suggesting this is also a message to the US, that the way to deter China is through winning in Ukraine, actually, not the opposite, not the other way around, not the opposite. And it's a fair argument to be made here, and that plays into a lot of points around the key establishment around Donald Trump and his new administration. But she also made important points when it comes to EU's approach to the Middle East and reaching a ceasefire there, carefully crafted, continuing the mention of the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, and also shown that EU has to be much more active in Africa, much more active with Latin America, building its own trade relations or expanding its trade relations and security relations. So she delivered a balanced speech then, despite some voices being raised here and even her cracking some jokes about that. I think that hearing went pretty well. So it seems that the EU Parliament, to come to your original question, despite the big worry about its new composition and how it's going to impact the functioning of the Commission, seems that with the central role of EPP, which is the biggest party in Parliament, and its ability to reach out both, on one hand, to the more right-wing groups, maybe the more moderate right-wing groups, not the extreme ones like AfD, for instance, and at the same time having the backing of a strong majority of socialists or Greens, allows this process to move forward. So far, it's been smooth, especially with the key confirmations for candidates for positions in areas of defense and security and foreign relations, as we've seen with Andrius Kubilius and Kaja Kallas.
Right, like you mentioned, there's definitely a lot of very expert, nimble kind of political maneuvering right there. So really impressive.
Certainly.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us, TVP World.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.